what's your criticism of the tradition of the left? And I'm asking this given I'm very curious, given you relate with the left, but you also constantly say that we have to think independently. We can't do hand-waving stuff. There are times you would say communism is a religion, and I understand what you mean. I feel sometimes that can be flattening, given the tradition of communism in the global south in particular is cannot be reduced if you compare what happened in the Soviet Union with comparable stages of developing countries. They did far better in terms of providing education, in terms of providing housing, in terms of sanitizing their streets out of extreme destitution. You see that in China today. I was in Beijing for 3 months and I walked the streets relentlessly and I couldn't find a single person who was begging. And I'm not exaggerating. I went to like 12 to 13 different cities. I couldn't find slums. I'm not saying that there are no problems. But when you compare that experience with that of India, for instance, you really get the meaning that the communism as a movement had a lot of success.
But is China communist anymore?
Okay, that's that's an open question.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think it's more corporate totalitarianism. But that doesn't negate any of the, successes of China in terms of lifting people out of poverty. On the other hand, they run giant sweatshops where workers are abused, live in dormitories. So again, there is no utopia. There is no perfect society. And that's why, in the end, I define myself as an anarchist, because it's a constant opposition to power in whatever form it takes. That, those of us who are intellectuals are eternal heretics. There are always, even the most well-meaning forms of power, because of the nature of power, engage in suppression. And that our job is always to be with those people who are being repressed or oppressed or demonized. Or that's where our job is to hold power accountable as journalists, to quote Amir.
I see that, and I completely follow that, and I think that is very fundamental within the left tradition, given the left has not held power for the longest.
But that's not true, because the left will go to places like, I saw it. They'll go, for instance, to Nicaragua under the Sandinistas. Now, the Sandinistas, when I covered the Contra War there and I covered the war in Salvador, they didn't engage in, a fraction of the human rights abuses that were daily occurring in El Salvador. So the left would go to El Salvador and be good. I mean, they go to the prisons. What they wrote of was true. I mean, the death squads, when I got to Salvador, they were killing 700 people a month. Then they go to Nicaragua and just fall on their knees. And George Orwell writes about this. And now the Sandinistas, they were not good toward the Mosquito Indians. It doesn't compare. I'm not comparing it. I'm just saying that we shred our credibility by not holding the same rigorous standard. This is really Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia, where he writes about the suppression of the POUM, which he was a member of, the anarchist units, and the Barcelona riots. And Victor Golantz, his publisher, wouldn't publish it because it didn't make the Republican government of Spain look good. And he said, look, and you talked about Coburn. Coburn's father invented stories to support that. And I come down with Orwell, that in the end, our credibility is key. And that, I used to say to these activists who came to Nicaragua, don't do this. You're falling into the trap, because they want to show that you're just useful idiots. And it discredits everything you've reported in Salvador, which is true. So the left is not always, the left is seduced. I mean, they would go to Cuba, they go to the old China. They used to take tours under Mao. And, they kind of lost all discernment and lost all critical faculties because, and I still think that happens. I see it with people who even go, worship Ortega. I knew Ortega. He was a gangster then. He's a gangster now. So the left is as seduced by let's call it militarism as the right. It's just militarism against empire.
I completely take your point that when it comes to things like militarism, when it comes to things like human rights abuses, dismantling or annihilating your opponents, these things, or even if we are flying aircrafts, for instance, the left and the right can be equally damaging. That's one segment of it. But when I think about the traditions of the left, I think about economic systems. I think about, you spoke about low wage in China. That's a very flat picture, because if you look at historical trajectory of Chinese wage, it has sharply risen since the Reform and Opening. Now, when you compare that flat rate with the US, then of course it is held down, because the model, after all, China adopted through Reform and Opening was the export-led model, which essentially meant holding down wage compared to if it had come from a domestic consumption-led growth. But you can't compare China to a utopia. You have to compare Chinese wage with Indian wage. And Chinese wage compared to Indian wage, for instance, is far higher than even their nominal comparison of the GDP. So if Chinese GDP is on PPP terms like 5 times that of India, wages of Chinese workers are much more than 5 times that of India. You have to think about the universalization of healthcare. I did 19 checkups in China, including the echocardiography and stuff like that, blood test, SIV. It cost me 3,300 Indian rupees, which is like 330 yuan. Even by nominal terms, in India, it cost you 4 times higher. One of my first exposure when I landed in the United States was I met this nice couple in a neighborhood in Chicago who recently got diagnosed with diabetes. And we talk about their lives, and they said this biggest misery in our life is that we can't buy insulin. Insulin is not even a problem in actually even not even in India, because we didn't hold the intellectual property rights of those generic drug makers. You can buy insulin here. So what I'm saying is, if you look at the long history of the left, I agree with you when it comes to suppression of facts. If you look at the famines, whether it's in socialist regimes or whether it's in colonial regimes, they are equally bad. But what I feel, and that makes me a committed leftist, is then when you look at the sum total, the balance sheet, there is something within both the empirical result, track record of the left, and the vision of the left that makes it stand apart from the right. I would love your response.
So what you've
that.
just reiterated is that section in Brothers Karamazov of the Grand Inquisitors. So do human beings want bread or freedom? Because you don't have freedom in China. That means complete suppression of dissent.
What do you mean? I mean,
I haven't been to China, so I'm a little reluctant.
When you say you don't have freedom in China.
You don't have the freedom of dissent. I mean,
okay.
You don't have it. I mean, in my understanding, and I've never been to China, so.
But freedom of dissent and freedom is freedom is a bigger subset. When you have housing, when you have healthcare, when you have food, when you can send your kids, and I think this is where I think the place we are coming from, because you are from the global north, where some of the material accessibility in general, I know there is deep inequality here as well. But for instance, one of the things that impressed me, I'll tell you this story, was when I was learning Chinese at Tsinghua, and I left my charging cable that I used to charge my phone on the power, and I went to my class, and a lady, Tsinghua is pretty elite, she came to my room and she cleaned my room, and she left a notice saying, by leaving that charger at the power, you put the whole building in an electrical hazard. Now, I, coming from India, felt 3 things. A woman in her mid-40s can write. You can go all over India. You can find one person who cleans your toilet who can actually even read, let alone write. That's a challenge. That's great freedom. Michael Parenti talks about this in his books. The second is, but that's not a great freedom when you look at it from the perspective of global north, because here you have working class who can actually read and write. The second thing is where someone who cleans your toilet can actually give you a notice. In places as hierarchical as in India and much of the Latin American global south, which is much more hierarchical than global north, you can't imagine someone who cleans your toilet can give you a notice. The immediate response is, who the hell are you? Do you know yourself? Which again, I can imagine like someone in the US, as hierarchical as it is divided between the 1% and the rest, you can imagine these things. Like there are things like rules and stuff that work. So when we talk about freedom, the discussion has to, I completely take your point about dissidence. You cannot rebel against the Communist Party, just as you cannot lead an insurrection against. This is not to justify the clampdown on the freedom of expression in China. I hate that. I also hate the overall disempowerment of the working class in China. Yes, they gained in terms of real wage, but politically they are disempowered. What I'm saying is, I find sometimes some of these blanket disregard of socialist states, particularly in the global south, a little bit problematic. Your response?
Well, I mean, so it's about 100 pages in the Brothers Karamazov, and he doesn't come to an answer.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've read it, but
No.
There's no answer. And there's no answer for precisely the reasons that you just raised. How important is freedom of expression? To probably the vast majority of people, it's not that important. But if you are going to propel your society forward and not intellectually and maybe spiritually calcify, it's vital. So I would not, as bad as it is here, if I was Chinese, I would have no voice at all. I don't. The way I critique systems of power here,
Right.
it'd be over. So I'm speaking from a very personal perspective. This is what I've done my whole life. It's all I've ever wanted to do. It would not be achievable within that system.
Right.
That doesn't take away from all the very important points that you made. But it does get to that age-old question, which Dostoevsky asked. I once was with Susan Sontag and we decided to, which was just a silly parlor game, but we were about to go into Sarajevo and it was being hit with a lot of shells and we were scared. And it was the night before we went in. We decided to decide what was the greatest novel ever written, which was silly. But it was the Brothers Karamazov for that reason, that it asked that question that you just raised, which is the most vital question for human existence. And I would hazard a guess that for the majority of people, the ability to read, write, is more important than, let's call it freedom of expression, but not for me. I've almost died for,
Right.
I don't want to be overly dramatic, but Sarajevo was very dangerous. El Salvador was very dangerous, and I went there, and many of my colleagues did die, because I wanted to give a voice to people who were fleeing. So I don't want to take away any of the points that you made, all of which are important. But from my personal perspective, that form of society would crush my being. And I do think freedom of expression and freedom for dissent is important. However, if you are living on a street and you don't have housing and you don't have adequate income or food or medical care, those are those are fundamental necessities that have to be met first. I agree. Yeah.
I agree with you that different elements of freedom cannot be made negotiable. Like one can't say that we offered you economic freedom and we take away your freedom of expression.
But I don't know if it's freedom. I think it's more, I mean, I look at healthcare or housing as a human right.
Okay.
I don't think it's freedom. I think that in an equitable and fair society, it's a right. And this is the tragedy. We've abrogated those rights here in the United States, whereas a country like China respects them. But it wasn't just China. I mean, even if you went to the old Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, I mean, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, those corporations could not raid Eastern and Central Europe fast enough because they had a highly educated population. And they all went to university for free, by the way. So, and then, of course, in the name of neoliberalism, they stripped away everything that was good about communism. Destroyed the educational system, destroyed the healthcare system.
Cheaply privatized national corporations.
Exactly. So there were, in socialist societies, these, this respect for what I would call essential human rights, which capitalist societies have never respected. And I think that given a choice, of course, and I think you're right to compare it to India. Given a choice, people will say, "Yeah, I'll."
Right.
But not me. I can't. But I've never suffered that level of economic deprivation either. And if I did, and if I was living on a sidewalk in New York City and couldn't get medication for whatever ailments I needed, and I couldn't get adequate food, and the police were harassing and beating me, and of course, those are basic necessities that have to come first.
One of our goals when we started off the platform, and that's why we named India and Global Left, we kept the part India because of the very principle that you said of being self-reflective. We kept it to not hide our place, that all the grotesque things that are happening in our society, we are part of that, and we should be accountable to that. And at the same time, we kept global because we felt genuinely that there are a lot of good ideas, at least in the global north, that doesn't necessarily get through in the global south, because it's the earlier it used to be Force and the World Bank. Now it's the Zuckerbergs and Tim Cooks that have made the biggest inroads and contacts with the global south. And good ideas in the global north often doesn't reach the global south. And at the same time, we also felt that some of the good ideas in the global north has to be critiqued in a comradely manner from the global south, because some of them are inadequate when looked at from the perspective of global majority. Just for an example is that within many of the American left, you find a total fascination with the post-war kind of Keynesian capitalism as the golden age of capitalism, which is true. I mean, you can look at it and compare with the neoliberal period, and you get it in terms of employment, in terms of wage. But in the global south, you don't have an equivalence of that. You don't have that golden phase of capitalism, of industrial capitalism, because colonialism impoverished it, the global south. And those who industrialized rapidly at least, largely moved away from capitalism, and they industrialized much more rapidly. So the point I'm getting at is even that kind of abundance that has been built in the Americas. There are books about American abundance, the very high growth from 1850s onwards. It was unstoppable. Like if you look at the causes of the Depression, a lot of that was overproduction. Prices were depressed so much that there has to be regulations to keep the prices up. You look at the global south, it's the exact opposite. The factors of production are so underdeveloped that there is scarcity all the time. And that's where I think I want to end by asking this final question when you said I'm an anarchist. We feel that it is very unreasonable to think about some degree of centralization. I'm not talking about eliminating dissidents. I'm not talking about those things. I'm thinking in lines of when there is power shortage, when you are not just sitting at the surplus oil reserve or all this whatever through fracking technology and stuff, and you want to industrialize, then you need to place limits or coordinate between a steel industry and the coal industry. And who does that? One way of doing that is the market mechanism, which should exist, and it works, but it doesn't work perfectly. So you need something to balance that. You can look at the stock market as well. The Chinese stock markets are constantly intervened by the party, sometimes by buying massive amount of stocks by state financial institutes, because Alibaba is getting too big to have undue influence, and they don't like it. But the Chinese state says that we are going to buy stocks forcibly to keep power out of this money game. Sometimes banks are instructed to give credits to keep the stock markets floated, because if that's so, what I'm saying is, in a scarcity condition, it's difficult to think about a world which is perfectly anarchistic. I can think about a world perfectly anarchistic and operating through this voluntary exchange in an abundant world where general levels of access to resources are generally greater. That's my last question. I would be interested in
I don't endorse an anarchist state. No anarchist movement, including in Spain, the anarchists in Spain wouldn't even run for office.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying I'm personally an anarchist.
But not the society's organization.
No, I don't think there's any example of an effective, Kropotkin maybe, but these are very limited. He talks about consensus only being possible among a group of 100. He actually puts a number on it, 150. And then when you move beyond that, it's essentially paralysis. I do like the old, immediately after the Russian Revolution, the old Soviets where workers control their own factories, which, of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks destroyed in what Noam Chomsky calls a counter-revolution. But I think all intellectuals have to be anarchists in the sense that they can't be beholden to power in any way, or controlled by power, or dependent upon power, because it destroys their ability to be intellectually honest. Mm-hmm. But anarchism as a system, it doesn't have much going for it, and in fact, it's the old communist systems, whether it's in Cuba or whether it's in the old Soviet Union or whether, and I lived in the former Yugoslavia, which created a kind of equity. You still had, as Pilo Vangelis called it, the new class. It's a longer discussion. But, one of the things I noticed when I was in Central and Eastern Europe is that all the kids went to summer camp. Mm-hmm. And they didn't pay. Everybody went. There's something so beautiful and human about that. Everybody had, as you said, access to healthcare. But I think that for those of us who seek intellectual independence and intellectual integrity, we have to define ourselves as anarchists or eternal heretics, is maybe another way to put it. That we're just a thorn in the side of whoever's in power. Mm-hmm. Even though we may be more sympathetic to one system. Right. I'm very critical of Bernie Sanders, but I think Bernie Sanders' commitment to the working class is real. I don't think he's disingenuous. However, I'm very critical of his decision to stay in the Democratic Party, to not challenge the military-industrial complex, to talk about a political revolution, and then as soon as Clinton becomes the nominee, he campaigns for Clinton. I found that really difficult to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
Political revolutions are not, number one, not created in an election cycle, and number two, obviously, was not being honest with us. So yeah, I mean in that sense. Yeah.
In that same spirit of anarchism of mind and freedom of thought, we try to have this conversation with you. We admire your work.
Thanks.
We seek more. We try to seek more clarity on certain points. And Chris Hedges, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.